it's written into law. And what he's done this morning is say, well, we're going to change the law, so there will have to be a bill that goes through Parliament to do this. And even though, because our gross domestic product this year is going to be a lot less, 11.3% less this year than last year, that the aid budget has already been cut to an extent by probably about £1.52 billion. But reducing it now from 0.7 to 0.5% will reduce it even further in future years. Now, to be fair, he says this is a temporary thing. Now, people have very strong views on this international development budget. You've seen today David Cameron come out and criticise the decision. In fact, all former prime ministers have criticised the decision. And this isn't really a left versus right issue, I don't think. There are plenty of people on the right who question what's happened today. When you have David Davis and David Cameron agreeing on something, you know that there's a bit of a problem. And I wonder whether there are going to be maybe 40 Tory MPs who could overturn this when it comes to a decision in the House of Commons. So I thought, well, how do we cover this tonight? We could just do a normal phone-in on international aid, but I thought, well, let's get somebody into the studio who knows a lot about it and who can actually answer some of the questions that I know you will want to put on this. Because I know from my Twitter feed this afternoon, a lot of you feel really strongly that charity begins at home, that we should be reducing the aid budget because we need to deal with poverty in this country first and foremost. I can articulate the arguments against that if you want me to, but I've got somebody who's far more capable of doing that than me, and he's looking forward to hearing from you as well. 0345 6060 973. Andrew Mitchell, welcome. You were, of course, International Development Secretary. It was a job that I think if you'd said to me in, say, 2005, that's the job I'd really like to do, I would have probably laughed. And I suspect you might have done too. But you kind of got religion over it, didn't you, when you were doing the job?
Well, evening, and it's very nice to see you again. I'll tell you what happened, actually. I had 5 years in opposition. And so at the beginning of the 5 years, I didn't know an awful lot about it. I knew what constituency members of Parliament know because we all interact with the NGOs. And in the royal town of Sutton Coldfield, we have very strong faith groups involved in Christian Aid and Save the Children and Oxfam and so forth. So I knew a bit about it, but not very much. But I had 5 years in which to work up what was to be a centre-right policy on international development. And I was able to travel around the world, look at what were the ingredients of wretched poverty, and sit at the feet of some of the people who really knew their stuff. For example, I went to see the man who set up the Grameen Bank, who invented microfinance, a chap called Professor Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. And he invented giving very small loans, particularly to women. 96% of the bank's clients were women, who then were entrepreneurs and who they might rear chickens or they might look after cows, but who were able to lift themselves and their families out of poverty. So I was able to learn for 5 years, sitting at the feet of these experts, what would and would not work in development. And you'll remember going to Rwanda. You came that first year of 10 annual visits to Rwanda for 2 weeks, where people interested within the Conservative Party in development came to see for themselves what works and doesn't work in a very poor country. And they formed a core within the party who were passionate about this and who would stand up for development. And it's larger than you would sometimes believe from the Daily Mail, but there is within the Conservative Party people who strongly agree with David Cameron that in a world where there are quite extraordinary depths of poverty and misery, we in our generation have the power and the ability, because we know so much more, to do something about it. And there is a very powerful internationalist streak of that in the Conservative Party, who are very dismayed by the announcement today, because what we've done is we've broken our promise to the poorest people in the world, and we've gone back on an absolutely explicit, clear manifesto commitment within the last year at the general election. And I am dismayed about that, and I think it is wrong, and I would like to see the government think again.
And the Prime Minister has broken a promise to you personally, hasn't he? Because I think you supported him in his leadership campaign, partly, at least in part, because he promised that he wouldn't do this.
Well, let's be fair to Boris. He's obviously changed his mind.
Yeah, but if you promise something like that, something that is actually on the statute book, okay, nobody could have foreseen the pandemic this time last year. And to be fair, in the legislation, I think there is a clause that says, well, in the event of catastrophic economic circumstances, this can be changed. But you must feel incredibly let down.
Well, let's not personalise it, because because there are people who you and I both respect who don't like the 0.7 and don't like the Act and so forth. And let's be clear that there is a clause in the Act. I helped draft the Act, but there is a clause in the Act which says that if you don't meet the 0.7, the minister has to turn up in Parliament and explain why. But that is not a get-out-of-jail-free card. That is a process where if it's missed by mistake, because it's the law of the land, if it's missed by mistake, a minister can explain. What you can't do is in advance say you're going to miss it. And that is why the government will require legislation. It'll have to get legislation through the House of Commons. It will have to get it through the House of Lords. And as it was a manifesto commitment, the House of Lords will not be bound by what I think you and I will recall is known as the Salisbury Convention, because it was in the manifesto. And the House of Lords undoubtedly, in my view, will kick it out and say, no, you've got to stand by your promise. This is a promise made to the poorest people in the world. And after all, a coalition government led by David Cameron, in 2010, in a time of great austerity, whatever you think about the austerity now, but in a time of great austerity, declined to balance the books on the backs of the poorest people in the world. And remember this, 5 years later, David Cameron, for the first time, for a long time, got a Conservative majority.
So what's behind this? Because Boris Johnson, and some people will laugh when I say this, but he's actually quite liberally minded on this type of issue generally. Rishi Sunak, I've never seen as an archetypal right-winger who would love to slash the aid budget, and yet that's exactly what they're about to do. What do you put it down to?
Well, I don't know, and I'm hugely sympathetic to Rishi, because he's got a very difficult job indeed. He's got to satisfy the markets that Britain is good for its debt at a time when our debt is rising enormously. And just for listeners, the figures, the debt this year as a result of coronavirus will be something like £400 billion. And the cut that's taken place in the development budget is about £4 billion. So it's 1% of that. And remember, the point about the 0.7 is that the 0.7 goes up and down with the British economy. So as we have seen, as you indicated, an 11% reduction in the size of our national income, so the development budget has already gone down, actually by more than that, because it's taken out of more than 1 year's programmes, by nearly £3 billion. So this is on top of that. And I think that is wrong, because the state of our economy is reflected in the fact that the amount going into development has gone down, and it's right and proper, as I have tried to explain to some of the NGOs who think that at a time of an international pandemic, we shouldn't be lowering it. We have to lower it, because the whole point about development spending is you will never get support from people in this country unless they see that the development spending gets its feet wet in the same way that every other part of the economy gets its feet wet.
Well, there's so much to talk about over the next 45 minutes. And I do want to go to calls in a moment. 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put your point of view to Andrew Mitchell. I think there are so many myths on aid spending as well, and people say, oh, well, it all goes into the pockets of dictators, and I think there was a time when a lot of it did. People think a lot of it goes to waste, but you and I have both seen how a lot of this money is spent. Obviously, we can't see how every single pound is spent, and I'm sure, just like any government department, there is waste somewhere along the line. But people talk about it going to countries that don't need it, like China, India, Pakistan is another one that people mention. How do you answer those points?
Well, first of all, let's be clear, because China has come up this week. I think there was a big piece in one of the tabloids about spending in China. On the day I became the Development Secretary in 2010, on the day, the first thing I did when I walked into the department was to say to the senior civil servants, no more checks for China. No more money for China. China is an emerging superpower. They have incidentally done remarkably well in lifting their people out of the extremes of poverty in a comparatively short period of time. No more money for China unless it's legally, contractually due. The money spent in China today is spent by the Foreign Office. The Foreign Office. They have access to the DFID budget, but it is their decision, and they are responsible, and they must explain why they're spending money in China.
What do they spend it on?
Well, they spend it on various things, which are, to a greater or lesser extent, classified as development. But it is their decision. And one of the differences, one of the reasons why it was such a mistake to abolish and dismantle DFID, is that DFID was well known around Whitehall for being extremely good with money. They were very, very good at justifying the taxpayers'
Didn't used to have
confidence.
that reputation, it has to be said.
Well, they as a shorthand, DFID did money and the Foreign Office does prose. The Foreign Office diplomats, who are amongst the most brilliant in the world, I have nothing but praise for them. They're not able to manage multi-million-pound projects, and that is a DFID skill. And we must just hope that enough of this brilliant DFID DNA remains in the new department so that the money really is well managed, because it is the absolute duty of anyone who spends British taxpayers' money in development to ensure that for every hard-earned pound they take off hard-pressed taxpayers, they are getting 100 pence of delivery for that money on the ground. And that is the duty of any minister spending aid money.
Okay, well, we dealt with China. What about India? India has a space program, and yet we're still spending money in India.
Well, we're not. India was the largest recipient of British aid every year from 1945 until 2010. And so when the coalition government came into power, I started winding down the programme, and the programme's now been wound down. There may still be some Foreign Office spending, but DFID wound it down. And what is more, half the money that went into India in those first 3 years, half of that money was in investment. So the British taxpayer, as it were, owns shares in companies in India and will get a return for that. And the other half was on technical advice. And the technical advice was aimed to make sure that, for example, in education, the technical advice from Britain assisted India in spending their own money in educating children. And remember this, that malnutrition, which is a terrible thing in our world today, the fact that in a world of plenty there are children who tonight will go to bed hungry and are starving in the developing world. You know, something like 50% of all the malnutrition in the world is found in India because it is such a big country. And therefore, British technical skill helping India to address that issue is money, in my view, that is very well spent. But the space programme argument is impossible to combat, and that is why we wound it down. And it's right that we should wind it down, because India too is powering out of poverty.
Well, for the next 45 minutes, Andrew Mitchell will be taking your calls, your questions, and we'll be hearing your views. 0345 6060 973. It's 17 minutes past 9.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
21 minutes past 9. If you're watching us on Global Player or the LBC YouTube, Facebook and Twitter feeds, you can see that Andrew Mitchell is with me. He's here with me until 10, taking your calls, and boy, are there a lot of them, as I thought there might be. Let's go to or is it Yao in Nunhead. Hello.
Hello. I just want to ask Andrew how much foreign aid goes to corrupt foreign officials rather than the public.
And you're from Ghana, aren't you? What do you think about the amount of foreign aid that we invest in other countries?
I think it's not bad, but the money don't get to the poor people, as you said. The money get to the corrupt officials. It doesn't get to the poor people, as they say.
Okay.
Give the money to charity to spend the money. That would be a good idea.
Let's put that to Andrew, because that is what a lot of people think, that the money goes to these countries, but it ends up in the Swiss bank accounts of foreign dictators. And that, I think, at least in part, used to be the case. But is it the case now?
No, and it's an important question that Yor raises, because the cancer at the heart of development is corruption. And so, going back to what we were saying a few moments ago, is the duty of anyone who has responsibility for these budgets to ensure that we get 100 pence of value for one hard-pressed taxpayer pound. And so we never go through governments in countries unless we are absolutely certain we can trust them. Now, in my time, we knew we could trust the governments of Ethiopia and Rwanda, for example, because when you give them a pound of taxpayers' money, you agree in your partnership about how it's going to be spent, and they spend it in the right way. So there was no problem there. But with a lot of other countries, because our relationship is not with the governments, it's with the people of those countries who Britain wants to help. Because of that, you have to go round the government and you have to bypass it, and you do that through UN agencies or through international NGOs, of which Britain is blessed with some of the greatest in the world. You know, organisations like Save the Children, Oxfam, Christian Aid, CAFOD, Water Aid. These are brilliant organisations which have transformed the lives of the poorest around the planet. So you've got to make sure that the money gets through directly, and that's why we don't go through governments.
But your contention is that it's still being the money is still being abused, basically.
You know, Britain, America gave Ghana medicine. I think about 6 years ago, diabetes medicine. The corrupt official, they sold all the medicine. When the American ambassador found out, he alert the government to go and check the medicine. The next day, they set up a fire. I think, Andrew, you may be familiar with this case. So they burn all where they store the medicine. Because of that, American ambassador said they would never give Ghana medicine again until they brought people to justice. So Andrew should know this about 6 years ago. You should know about it.
Well, it sounds as though it was shortly after my time, but we've always in Britain in the last decade had absolutely zero acceptance of corruption, and wherever corruption takes place, we try to stop it. But I remember, a very interesting meeting in Kenya where I went down. There was about £3 million that had gone missing, and I went down to see the Minister of Finance and say, it's not good enough. We have to have this money back. It's been stolen from British taxpayers, and we got it back. But the minister did say to me, you have no truck with corruption, nor do I. And remember, it was we who discovered this money had been taken, and we told you, the British government. So we are on your side in this, and we all want to combat corruption.
Because there are always accusations about sort of slightly pseudo-colonial attitudes here when you're dealing with especially former colonies. Did you ever feel that you had to tread a bit carefully in that regard?
I certainly did, and it's a partnership. It's not us telling them what to do. You agree a series of principles, and in the old days, there was a bit of us telling them what to do, and it didn't work, because if you try and force a country to adopt policies they don't really approve of, in the end, they won't adopt them. So it's about partnership, it's about agreeing a series of principles, what hard-pressed British taxpayers' money will go into, agreeing with them that it goes with the grain of what they want to achieve, and those are the best partnership relationships.
OK, Yor, thank you very much. Let's go to Peter in Waterloo. Peter, what's your question, please?
Oh, well, my question is that I think Andrew Mitchell's talking a load of tosh. After he gets off his club-class flight, The question is coming. After he gets off his club class or first class flight to Entebbe and stays in the Speak Hotel, or maybe if he's lucky, the British Embassy, if he went round the markets with me, where I go round annually for the last 30 years, and saw the United Nations food parcels, the European Union food parcels, the gift of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland food parcels being sold mafiosi illegally in the markets of Entebbe and Kampala, that is our aid money. Now, the Minister mentioned Kenya a few seconds ago. Does he remember about 15, 20 years ago when our government decided to pay all the primary school teachers in Kenya? Do you remember that agreement?
If it was 15 or 20 years ago, it was a bit before my time. But
it doesn't matter if it was before your time. I wasn't ever a minister, but I remember it. So I'm sure you remember it. Now, the teachers in Kenya, the primary school teachers, went on strike. They went on strike because they hadn't been paid for about 18 months. Where had the money the British government gave to the Kenyan government to pay the primary school teachers gone?
But we've already said 15, 20 years ago, and I'm sure that sort of thing did happen. Andrew's contention is that it happens far less today than it did then.
Well, let me have a crack at.
Still go to Uganda.
Let me have
Kenya,
a crack at Peter's question.
Tanzania, no.
Okay.
Let me have a crack at your question, Peter, and see if I can get you on side a little bit. I mean, first of all, what you have described is why, after that, subsequent to that, you don't put money into the government's coffers. If you can't be sure to trust the government, then you don't put money through governments. And increasingly, practically no British aid now goes through governments because you can't be certain that you can look the taxpayer in the eye and say it's well spent. But what you're describing in the markets of Uganda, if ever that is found to happen, we immediately investigate and we stop whatever supply has got contaminated in that way. And that's what you're describing as a World Food Programme problem. But let me give you the other side of the coin. You know, not far away in Karamoja in North Uganda, the British taxpayer joined forces with the World Food Programme, which was feeding starving people in the arid north in Karamoja. We joined forces because they were feeding about 2 million people who were starving for $25 a year. And we said, listen, what we will do is we will give an extra $5 per head, making it $30 a year. But instead of feeding them, let's irrigate properly. Let's teach them irrigation. Let's help them set up markets. Let's help them build feeder rows. Let's help them have cold storage. Let's help them have reservoirs to maintain the water. And you know, after 3 years of that extra $5, of the 2 million, something like 1.7 million had been floated off food aid. Now, that is the way in which the World Food Programme and Britain have worked together. And that's a really good example of British development working at its very best. Your story from the Ugandan markets. Your story from the Ugandan markets is where it's gone wrong.
Yeah, I'm very happy to hear that you're getting involved in Karamoja, along with the Catholic CAFOD, the Catholic Aid for Overseas Development, along with the Bishop of Karamoja, a man I know quite well, Damiano Guzzetti. I'm glad you're getting involved in Karamoja, the poorest part of the whole of that region, where the people live in dire poverty, most of them. I'm so happy, but don't forget you're including that in the NGOs' development, money and projects and things. So it's not just the British money that's getting through to Karamojong. It's private people's donations as well.
Absolutely. There you are, Peter. I told you we'd reach some agreement.
But I still think going to Uganda regularly, like I do, where I pay for my own flight, I pay for my own hotel, I don't stay at the British Embassy. The British Embassy don't want to know us, I can assure you. Nothing, or very, very little. Why am I still collecting street kids off the streets in Kampala if our millions is getting through to them? It's not happening, Minister. It's not happening.
Well, why? But I mean, what are you suggesting? What are you suggesting? That no British money should go?
I'm suggesting no British money should go without absolutely 100% accountability.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree.
100% accountability.
Well, excellent. You're both on the same side then. We got there in the end. Thank you very much indeed, Peter. We'll take more of your calls in a moment. You can ask a question, you can put a comment, you can put your opinion. That's what we're here for. It's 9:30 on LBC. Rachel Gerrish has the news headlines.
The Chancellor says the devastation caused by coronavirus will see the biggest hit to the UK's economy in 300 years. In his spending review for the next 12 months, Rishi Sunak cut contributions to foreign aid, while public sector workers will have their pay frozen unless they're in the NHS or earn under £24,000 a year. In the past few minutes, Donald Trump has pardoned his former national security advisor, Michael Flynn. He had pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI about his contact with a Russian ambassador before the now outgoing president took office. He was never sentenced. And there will be 3 days of national mourning in Argentina to remember the footballing legend Diego Maradona. The World Cup winner, regarded by many as the greatest player of all time, has died of a heart attack at the age of 60. There have been silences held in all of tonight's Champions League matches in his honour. LBC weather, cloud and rain clearing tonight. Most areas will feel quite chilly with frost and freezing fog patches. Lows of -3 in Scotland and 3 in the southeast of England.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Iain Dale. Tweet at LBC.
9:35, Andrew Mitchell is here taking your calls. Let's go to Ravi in Ruislip. Hello, Ravi.
Oh, hi there, everyone. Good evening. Just a quick comment. We've seen a rosy picture from you, Andrew, but what about, we become a major arms exporter, yet we're cutting foreign aid. So are we saying we're quick to support conflicts and wars, but not the fallout after? Because that's what we're heading towards, right? I mean, I work in northern Iraq. I haven't seen any DFID projects. I've been there for a year. I'm not sure how you're funding, but when charities like us, small charities, need to apply for funding, we need to employ a consultant, pay a huge wage to do the writing for grants. So, I mean, this arms export against cutting the budget is immoral. And where do you stand on that?
Well, Ravi, they're two separate things, really. I mean, on arms exports, which is always controversial, in Britain we do have the toughest, tightest arms control regime. Getting an arms license to sell weapons overseas in Britain is the most difficult place to do it.
And yet some of our arms are being used by the Saudis in Yemen, apparently.
Yes, they are. And I've been a tremendous critic of government policy in Yemen, which I think is incredibly misconceived and is actually in danger of radicalizing tens of thousands of young people in Yemen who have suffered so grievously. But the point I'm making is that they are separate issues. And indeed, Yemen actually is a very good example of where they're extremely confused, because you've got one arm of the government, as it were, which is bombing the main port in Hodeidah and trying to put it out of action in the coalition, the Saudi coalition, and another arm of the government which is trying to get food in through this port and repair the port and mend the cranes so that people don't starve. So there is an enormous confusion of political objective there. But they are two separate issues, and we need to have a very, very tough and tight arms export regime on the one hand, but also we need to make sure that development has a chance to stop conflict, stop it starting, once it's started, end it, and reconcile people afterwards, because it's much cheaper to stop conflict with soft power than it is to have to put countries and different areas back together again after there's been war fighting. After all, memorably, General Mattis, the defense secretary in America, said to Donald Trump, whenever you cut aid, I have to increase my order for ammunition. And it's true, soft power development helps make countries more prosperous and helps to tackle conflict and stop it from starting.
OK, Ravi, thank you very much. Sir Peter Fahey is listening to the programme. He's just tweeted this. Great debate on LBC with Andrew Mitchell. Can only say from my own experience with UK aid, there is tight accountability for how our foreign aid is used in Uganda and Ethiopia, and it does huge good. Jude is in Bristol. Jude, what would you like to say?
Yeah, good evening, Ian and Andrew. I never cease to be shocked by the number of homeless people on our streets, and I just wondered whether Andrew thinks that in a recession of all times, we should refocus our resources on our own communities and in the meantime force corrupt governments to restructure themselves and demonstrate their credibility before they receive our help.
Well, good evening, Jude. I mean, one of the interesting points you make about the homeless on the streets, which has been a huge issue, is the quite remarkable success the government has had in virtually overnight ending that as part of the coronavirus
That's just
measures.
Simply not true. Every night when I walk from Leicester Square to Charing Cross, I must walk past at least a dozen people who are sleeping rough on the streets.
Well, in Birmingham, where in November last year we had 76 rough sleepers, virtually every single one of them earlier this year, when the lockdown started,
that is true, but that's not true
addressed.
now. Not true now.
Well, it shows that governments can deal with this. And the point that Jude is making, you often hear people say that charity begins at home, and it does begin at home, but it doesn't end there. And what I would say is that the 0.7 allows our generosity as a country to those much less fortunate than ourselves to be tapered down when our own economy cannot afford it. And it's an important point. The development budget is not a fixed sum of money. It's a sum of money that reflects the state of the British economy. And the promise that we made many years ago, and which was implemented by David Cameron's government, to meet that promise to the poorest people in the world and allocate 70 pence in £100 of public expenditure to helping the least well off.
Jude, do you want to come back on Andrew there?
Yeah, I mean, I think development's a noble aim. And Andrew, I'm a fellow Conservative, so I want to agree with you. But the first responsibility of any government is to protect its own people. And homelessness, as you say, it may be decreasing. I mean, anecdotal evidence says otherwise. But when we are hundreds and billions of dollars in debt, it's not going to get any better. So should we not reprioritise our own spending?
Well, as I said, we're talking about a saving here of 1% of the borrowing. So it's a lot of money, but it is seen in that way, it puts it into the right context. And, I would argue that every penny of the British development budget is spent in Britain's national interest, because it makes the world a safer place, and it makes the world a more prosperous place. It gets into areas of ungoverned space which threatens us too. Example of Somalia, for example, where not long ago there were more British passport holders training in terrorist camps in Somalia than there were in Pakistan or Afghanistan. So, tackling these problems with soft power wherever we can is very much in Britain's interest. It makes Britain safer and more prosperous as well.
OK, Jude, thank you very much. Paul in Hanwell says it's a simple calculation to make that if we spend more on poor people in other countries, there is less money left to spend on poor people in this country. Fortunately, we live in a democracy, so if voters don't agree with the party which proposes high overseas aid spending, if the screen can scroll up, that would be helpful. I can't see the end of that text, but anyway. OK, right.
I think that's a very interesting point. All parties in Britain elected into the Parliament, all of them have supported the 0.7 as the right level of spending to help people much more desperate than we are. But of course, Paul is right that our first duty is to look after our own constituents, and that is what we do. But my argument is that a very small amount of public expenditure should be spent on promoting a safer and more prosperous world overseas. Well, that's a small amount of money, but it should be spent.
I've now got the end of Paul's text. It says, it is a foolish party which doesn't listen to the new blue working class. Now, he would argue that that's exactly what Rishi Sunak has done.
Well, I think that it's the job of politicians and it's the job of political parties to do what is right and to try and persuade people that what they're doing is right. And as I said, all political parties in Britain have signed up to the 0.7, and it's the job of people like me and my colleagues to try and persuade Paul that it's in his interests that we don't turn our back internationally and that we do continue to champion development. It's in our interests as well as in the interests of the people we're trying to help.
OK, let's go to Helen in Liverpool. Hello, Helen.
Hello, Mr.
Hi.
Mitchell.
Hi.
Can you tell me, is there a rigorously detailed audit available to UK citizens to see exactly how their money is spent? And if so, where is it available?
Helen, that's such a good question. We decided in 2010 that there was no hope of persuading the British public that this policy really mattered unless we were totally transparent and open. And so we made the decision that all expenditure by what was then DFID, above £500, would be put into the public domain through the internet and through the relevant website. So all amounts over 500 through the transparency guarantee were made available to the public. And I think that was a very important piece of progress that was made to try and persuade people that it was the right thing to do. And do you know, in spite of the austerity in 2010 to 2012, in the middle of 2012, we did some polling, and it showed very interestingly that support amongst the British public, in spite of the austerity for the government's development policies, had gone up from 46% to just under 50%. I think it was 49.8%. But very interestingly, the support was much higher amongst women and much higher still amongst people under the age of 35. So, if you argue the case, if you put the case and with some passion and conviction, I would argue that the public will listen to you, they'll give you a hearing, and that actually support goes up, not down.
But they're not doing that now, are they? They've given up on that. With the abolition of DFID, merging it into the Foreign Office, and this move today, they're not interested in that agenda anymore.
Well, you may well be right in what you're saying, Iain, but I think there are a lot of us in Parliament who think this really matters and who have not lost interest in this agenda. OK, right. More of your questions in a moment. Helen, thank you very much for that. It's 9:45.
Coming up at 10 on LBC, Tom Swarbrick.
A pay freeze across the public sector for all but the NHS frontline and the lowest paid, says the Chancellor. He says an across-the-board increase wouldn't be fair on those in the private sector. Is that fair?
Tom Swarbrick on LBC. Iain Dale on LBC.
9:49. More questions to Andrew Mitchell. Stuart is in Harrogate. Stuart, you've got a deep question, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm just interested. I mean, we've got to look after ourselves. But is the foreign aid, is it political or is it humanitarian? When we look at the moment, we've got the Chinese. They are spending millions and billions in Africa. They're building roads, they're building schools. They're doing colonisation, what we did 200 years ago. And I just wonder where we're really talking about here. And if you look at Afghanistan, when the war was on in Afghanistan, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Chinese were also in there, and they're actually building, helping to build mines. Where are we with this? We've got to look after ourselves first. We've got people, we're talking about food banks, we're talking about everything else. And the government and the chancellors...
But Stuart, that's the thing. We have food banks. We use this word poverty an awful lot, but I've said it before, and I'll say it again. We don't know what poverty is in this country compared to the kind of poverty that is experienced in other countries. So do you not think that those people who experience true poverty deserve a bit of a lift up from us?
I agree with that, but not when we're giving $5.5 million to Chinese women to learn how to cook an egg.
Well, I think that sounds to me like a bit of a tall story, Stuart. But your point is a very interesting one. I mean, foreign aid is above all humanitarian in the broader sense, but we have to decide where we're going to spend it. So, when we had a good look in 2010, when the coalition government was elected, we reduced the number of countries in which we had programmes from 43 to 26, and then it went up to 27 when South Sudan, very poor country, became a separate state. So we made some political decisions. We decided where we thought our money should be spent, countries which had a particular historic link with ours, for example, or through the Commonwealth. And we did, as I say, reduce the number of programmes quite a lot. So you have to apply that sort of logic. But above all, what British aid is doing is it's saving lives, improving lives. And let me give you just one example. We held in 2010 an enormous international conference in London designed to secure money for vaccinating children. And we've just had a replenishment of it and got even more money, which Boris Johnson led very successfully. Now, back in 2010, as a result of that decision taken by Britain and supported by the British Parliament, it meant that we were vaccinating a child in the poor world every 2 seconds and saving the life of a child every 2 minutes from diseases which, thank goodness, our children don't suffer from in the developed world and in Britain. So, we have to be very clear how we're going to spend it. We then must seek to explain to people and justify it, to explain that charity does indeed begin at home, as you said, but that it doesn't end there, and to try and explain why it's in Britain's interests as well as the people we're trying to help.
But of course, there will be less money to go around now. The aid budget or development budget is going to be cut by effectively about 30%. What will the impact of that be?
Well, the impact will be very serious. If you take it across the piece, it will mean that 1 million girls who Britain was going to educate in the poorest parts of the world won't get an education. It will mean that 7.6 million girls and women won't get access to family planning and contraception. And that's very important because many people on the right of politics believe that we should... that they talk about population control, but what they mean is that there are too many mouths to feed. And it must be right to allow women to have the choice for themselves over whether and when they have children. 7.6 million of the poorest women in the world won't get access to that. 3.8 million people will not get access to clean water. And remember that waterborne diseases every day, every week, kill thousands and thousands of mainly children. So, and there'll be a whole series of other knock-on effects, because you cannot take 30% out of a budget, in addition to the 10% we've already taken out this year, without having a massive effect on the work that Britain is doing.
Have you been able to sit down with Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak and told them that?
Well, Rishi was kind enough to call me at the weekend and tell me what he planned, and we were able to have a short discussion about this. But the point I've been trying to make today in the House of Commons is that because of the 30% cut, 100,000, just over 100,000, mainly children, will die. These are preventable deaths, which Britain, with its programme, would have prevented. And, we're moving heaven and earth to stop people dying of COVID in Britain.
So you're
we've had 50,000 deaths.
Telling me now that this decision will kill 100,000 children.
I am telling you that the 30%, if applied across the piece, will have all the effects I have just described, including not vaccinating a group of children, which will mean that there are 100,000 preventable deaths as a result.
You could argue, I suppose, just to play devil's advocate, that if our aid budget was 0.9% as opposed to 0.7%, you could save another 100,000.
That is true, but even I wouldn't argue it should be more than 0.7. 0.7 was a promise. It was a promise made to the poorest and most vulnerable people in the world. It was a promise that was in the manifestos of all the major political parties elected to the House of Commons, and we are planning to break our promise.
Right. Stuart, thank you for that. Let's go to Oliver on the Wirral. Hello, Oliver.
Hello, good evening.
Evening, what would you like to say?
I have something written down so I don't really deviate in asking a question of Andrew Mitchell. It gets there in less than a minute. We are borrowing to get money. We are running an incredible deficit. There are many people relying on food banks to feed themselves and their children. Feeding children in the UK during the school holidays has been an issue. Is this moral? And my first question, I have a couple of follow-ups.
Well, we'll just do the first one because we're near at the end of the show.
My first question, what are the metrics of morality here?
Well, I think it goes back to the phrase that we've already used tonight, that charity does begin at home. And of course, that my top responsibility is to make sure that poverty in Sutton Coldfield is addressed. We have 2 food banks in Sutton Coldfield. They're a very important part of the community, and it is my first duty to look after my constituents. But the point we've made several times tonight is that charity begins at home but doesn't end there. So I think that in a very interdependent world, we cannot turn our backs on the quite extraordinary levels of poverty which Iain was describing a moment ago. We cannot turn our backs on that if we want to have a safer, less conflict-ridden and more prosperous world. So the answer to your question really is we have to do both. But if you're asking me which is the most important, I freely concede that looking after our own constituents is our number one priority.
One more question, Oliver.
A follow-up. Just to quote what Iain said some time ago, quote, "We do not know what true poverty is in this country," unquote. I wonder if you might like to reflect on that.
Well, that is Iain who made that point, and I think there is poverty in Britain. It's often poverty of opportunity. It's a level of inequality. I think what Iain was saying, if I may defend Iain, is that if you see poverty in Uganda, which we were talking about earlier, if you see, as I have done, queues of children standing up who are suffering from malnutrition and sometimes acute malnutrition, then that is a level of poverty that you do not see in the developed world. And that is true, you don't. But poverty has a different form in the developed world, and I wouldn't want in any way to minimise that.
I think the word poverty has been debased in this country by the preface of the word relative. When we talk about relative poverty, we're not talking about poverty, we're talking about people who are slightly less well off than somebody else. Poverty is when you haven't got anything to eat, you haven't got anything no roof over your head, your life expectancy is minuscule. That is what I would define as poverty. We could go on, but we won't because we've reached the end of the programme. Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much indeed for joining us on LBC tonight. I'll be back tomorrow at 7. Coming up at 1, Darren Adam. But next on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick.
Iain, thank you very much indeed. Evening all. Welcome to the show. Tonight at 10.
The OBR forecasts the economy will contract this year by 11.3%, the largest fall in output for more than 300 years.
Tonight, it's confirmed the worst economic outlook for Britain in 300 years.
Our health emergency is not yet over, and our economic emergency has only just begun. So our immediate priority is to protect people's lives and livelihoods.
The recovery will, with a helpful